Hey everybody, my name's Sarah. This is my best friend Judy. We're going to talk about some books. Okay, so this week we're going to kind of talk about something called critical race theory, which I'll get into in a little bit. But first, we both read two books. One of them is called Can I Touch Your Hair? Oh no, is it going to be backwards like that? And I'll link this below. But, Judy, what was something that you noticed about the book?
Just reading through it, one line that stood out to me was in the Beach Day poem, and it just says, "I'm confused. Why do people who want to look like me hate me so much?"
Yeah, let's show that one.
Okay.
I don't know if the words are going to be backwards, but I'm going to show the pictures at least. So that poem was written from the perspective of Charles versus Irene, which is pretty significant because there's two different characters that are writing persona poems in this book. Irene is a young white girl and Charles is a young black boy, and they're in the same class and they are having to work on a poetry project together. But the book kind of tells stories of events that are going on that are similar in each other's lives, but how they're drastically different based on their races. And so that one that you picked out is pretty significant because if we relate it back to what I just talked about, critical race theory is basically stating that racism is everywhere, but the more really nasty racism is the racism that we hear about, because that's what's talked about. We don't talk about racism in everyday terms usually, or not even everyday terms, but everyday situations, even though it is there. So that, for example, is talking about a situation where a young black boy is feeling firsthand the effects of racism, but that is not something that's talked about because he is a young black boy. Why would his voice be heard in a way? And even if a young white girl talked about it, it still would be not acknowledged because it's not like, for example, Black Lives Matter, where people are dying over it. That's talked about and it should be talked about, but that should also be talked about. The fact that this is really nuanced versions of it, and it needs to be acknowledged. So that was a really good one to bring up.
Thank you.
So, did you notice anything else? Did it make you feel a certain way?
I think more than anything, it just kind of, you see two kids that are just feeling insecure, and that's never good. It's sad.
Yeah, it is sad. And another thing to note about this book is the authors were actually Irene and Charles. So the characters in these books are the authors. And they, from my understanding, were kind of like pen pals, which is kind of cool. So they wrote this book, not totally together. They, wrote their poems and kind of kept writing off of each other, which was, I've never heard of authors doing anything like that.
I read that little excerpt on the back, and
Yeah.
they ended up becoming really good friends.
Really good friends over time. And,
Yeah.
That's how these poems became possible, is because they just built this really strong friendship around it, which was really cool. Okay, so the other book that we read was Separate is Never Equal by Duncan Tonatiuh. I think it's T-U. I'm not sure about that. So what did you want to point out about this one?
Other than the fact that it was heartbreaking as well.
Mm-hmm.
So there was just this one page. Do you want me to read it first before I show it?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. That fall, Sylvia and her brothers had to attend Hoover Elementary, better known as the Mexican School, on Olive Street in the city of Westminster. The building was a clapboard shack, and the halls were not spacious or clean. A cow pasture surrounded the school. The students had to eat their lunch outside, and flies would land on their food. There was an electric wire that surrounded the pasture to keep the cows in. If you touched it, you received a shock. The school did not have a playground, not even a swing. And here's that. Can you see that? I can't
Yeah, here, I'll
see what I'm doing.
There we go.
Thanks.
So it just points out really what their school grounds look like. Doesn't look like a school ground, it looks like a farm. And they're just having to sit there eating, surrounded by flies, and they even drew, or the author and illustrator even drew the cows, and like, it's a cow pasture, so there's cow manure everywhere, and that's disgusting. So, okay, also a good one to point out. Let me get my notes here on this one. And also, I'll make citations for all these as well as this article, which is where I'm getting the critical race theory information from, which is pretty significant. So for this book, there's a lot that can connect to critical race theory. But one thing that I noticed is that throughout the book, she kept saying to herself, that's not true, like in her mind. And like that just pointed it out so clearly to me, that the amount of times that this young girl who was fully aware, that's the thing, she wasn't fully aware of what was going on, but she was able to tell herself, that's not true, and then justify why it wasn't true. If that's the case, that is clear racism happening, and she was experiencing that, and it wasn't brought to anyone's attention because she's just one case, and she's a young girl, and it's just school. It's just school. Again, because nobody was dying over it. It wasn't these major effects at the time, or what people thought were not major effects. So this book really, really clearly pointed that out. I had one spread that I wanted to show. And I like this spread because you can so clearly see the emotions on their faces. One thing I was telling Judy before we started this was that the author, he's also the illustrator, he does the artwork by making them kind of like ancient cave drawings, but then he makes them more contemporary by using, what's that called? Collage work. Mm-hmm. But the facial expressions were just so clear in this picture, and I thought that was really noteworthy in this book, just because this is a really heavy, emotional book to read, but it's worth reading. And another thing is the author and illustrator, he's from Mexico, so he grew up in Mexico. He wrote this book in hopes that children would read it and see themselves and learn that their voices are just as important as anybody else's, so that they could see kids that look like them, but also for kids that don't look like them to read it and understand that this story is out there. Because one thing that he said in his author's note was that the Mendez case has only recently started to receive recognition, which is true. Like, I went all throughout school not knowing this was a case.
Yeah.
I knew Brown versus Board of Education, but I did not know this one, so I thought that was really important. But that's pretty much it. Do you have anything else you want to?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Thanks for watching our vlog.